Hey, what's up, gang? Welcome back to the show. Today I'm joined by Jessica Lowe, who is a real voice in the space of trauma. She's an empowering educator for adults with complex trauma. She's a writer, a mental health advocate. And today is a conversation I've been looking forward to for a little while. If you follow this show, you know I like to follow my own curiosity and provide you guys with really anything that's going to be somewhat useful, whether that's something that helps you think better, feel better, understand ourselves a little bit more. And the space of trauma is one that I've just started dipping my toe into, and I'm excited to unpack that a little bit more with this wonderful person. So Jess, thanks so much for carving out the time and coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's very exciting. I love it when people get curious about this topic, because it really is a bit of a can of worms once you open it, and you can't really see the world the same way once you understand it.
Very true. I alluded to it just then, but it's something that I've just started exploring, and it's a real rabbit hole to dive into. One, because it's interesting, and then two, you can really start to identify certain things that may be of use to move forward, or things that may have stopped us in the past, or there's a lot to unpack anyway. But I reckon to start, just to set the scene and give people some context, the idea of complex trauma, complex PTSD. Could you give us an insight as to what that is all about, and then we'll unpack it a bit more?
Yeah, so a lot of what I do comes from my own journey and own lived experience. I was diagnosed with this thing called complex PTSD. A single mum of two kids. At the time, I was married, and I had a breakdown. Didn't know what was going on, suffered from very severe anxiety that was triggered by various life circumstances. And I was sent to a psychologist, like a very highly sought after psychologist. My GP did not know what to do with me, but he was like, I wanted to send you to the best, got me into someone who you couldn't get into. And she didn't know what to do with me because I was suffering from high anxiety. I was having body symptoms. So it felt like my body was being electrocuted all day. I was only sleeping every second night. So I was having symptoms that scared the shit out of me, because when I did all my Google searching, it seemed to fit into multiple different categories. So I was like, I'm fucked, basically. And the more that no one knew what was going on, the more terrified I got, which made the cycle worse. And all that they could come to was that I was suffering from severe anxiety. And so generally when you get diagnosed with a mental health condition like a anxiety or depression, let's say, the approach is the big evidence-based approaches that we have and that our psychologists are taught are generally mind-focused therapies. So therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy, where really we are working with the prefrontal cortex and hoping that that part of the brain is working so that we can say, if we're anxious about a particular thing, the therapist is looking for what is she afraid of and how can we reframe that, and how can she reframe that. Or exposure therapies, which is what they were trying to basically use on me, which things like if you're afraid of a particular feeling or afraid of a spider, and they'll bring the spider into the room a little bit so that you have to deal with the feeling. Now, when my therapist started to use these approaches on me, I got worse. It terrified me, because the feelings that I was having in my body, I was having cognitive delusions, like thinking that, it's very hard to explain, but if you talk to anyone with complex trauma and they're having a resurfacing of their trauma, it feels like your brain has been shattered into 1,000 pieces. There are feelings, emotions, and thoughts that don't match the current circumstances that you are in. It can feel like you're going crazy. I thought I was going to end up in the gutter, like living on the street, a crazy person. Like I very much was terrified. And as the therapist offered these therapies and it wasn't working, naturally I became more and more spiraled, and she pretty much gave up on me and said, Jess, your issue is that you have such a need to control situations that we need to just get you more comfortable with that feeling. That is like the worst thing that you could ever do to someone with complex trauma. So in answering what is complex PTSD, it is not just anxiety. It is not just depression. It's not something that you can think your way out of. Complex trauma and of how systems, our whole nervous system, how it was wired to interact with the world from childhood. So it's caused by childhood trauma, mostly in the developing stages of our life, or long-term ongoing interpersonal trauma, things like prisoner of war situations. But it's mostly when you've grown up in domestic violence or childhood abuse over a long period of time while your brain was developing, it changes the way our brain physically forms, and it's actually a physical brain injury, which affects the nervous system. And it's very much not understood in the mainstream medical community yet. It's starting to become understood, but in Australia, we've got a long way to go. Our social services workers know all about it, because once you are trauma informed, you understand why crime happens, why addictions happen, why a lot of our social problems happen, and they're more concentrated within certain low socioeconomic groups or minority groups, or groups that have a lot of injustice or trauma. But it doesn't discriminate, and it can be across all socioeconomic groups and groups of people.
And so is this something that is wildly rare, or is it something that's actually extremely prevalent? You know, we talk about, I've highlighted on this show a number of times,
extremely prevalent,
how much like anxiety, depression, mental health issues Australians are rife with, all kinds of challenges. So we know how prevalent that is. But when it comes to something like complex trauma, you know, I'd argue that the majority of listeners potentially may not have heard that terminology until just now. So based on the journey that you've gone through and what you've looked into, is this something that's actually surprisingly common amongst adults today?
It is so common, and it is more common than we realize. Like, we often segregate mental health into different categories. So we've got our depression people, we've got our anxiety people, but we also know that complex trauma is beneath a lot of those things. So once you understand trauma neurobiology, the way childhood trauma affects brain development and our nervous system, anxiety can be it's a protective response. It's a normal response if we're suffering from panic disorders, which was part of what I experienced. And then you understand your own trauma that's beneath it. It starts to make sense of why we do also suffer from things like depression and anxiety, because they're actually protective. So rather than looking at the symptoms, complex trauma looks at the root cause. And even in psychiatry, before psychiatry became about drugs, it used to be, you know, you'd go and you'd lie in that chair and you'd talk about your childhood. We don't do that anymore. And the psychiatrist, so the way I actually found out I had complex PTSD was a close friend of mine who I lived with before I got married. So I was just really lucky to have a close contact in the field of psychiatry. She had specialized in complex trauma because she noticed that in her field of psychiatry, nothing that they were doing was helping people. She continued to see women particularly coming in with abuse from partners and children with the issues as well. And nothing that they were doing was working. They were just labeling them with personality disorders and looking at the anxiety and the PTSD when there was more beneath it. So she started to research complex trauma out of her own interest, and she picked it up in me straight away. And luckily, complex PTSD was only labelled as a diagnosis in 2018. So if this had happened in 2016, I probably would have been put into the system and labelled as, you know, you've got a personality disorder, or maybe you've got bipolar or something else. It's very misdiagnosed.
So I want to get into the roots of this. And you mentioned, you know, complex PTSD is largely about the root cause as opposed to, just treating symptoms. And we'll talk a bit more about symptoms soon, whether it's psychological or physiological. But in terms of then getting to the root cause, is there a sample size of people that are potentially unaware what that might be? Because I know the body, the mind has crazy mechanisms of like blocking things, hiding things, forgetting things. So what does that process look like for someone? Is it always the case that they have an awareness of, hey, this situation took place, or I went through this? Or is there also a group of people that maybe, they've gone through some sort of experience as a child or a young adult and perhaps have either forgotten it or they've just disregarded it as it's not that big a deal yet, when in reality, maybe it's actually playing
100%.
out. Yeah.
Look, the mechanisms are there. We're human beings. Our brains, our attachment, we need everything as a baby that comes into our attachment with our parents will form the way our brain physically grows. We know this. It affects our epigenetics. We know through the work of John Bowlby, who is like the father of attachment theory. We know through the work of people like Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score. We know through the work of Stephen Porges, polyvagal therapy. We know that when our brain is developing, we have protective survival mechanisms that are in place. And part of that, as you sort of touched on there, is the shutting down of memory and fragmentation. So what happens in the brain when we have trauma really is just the way I've heard it described by people like Peter Levine, who's another great expert in understanding trauma is just any experience that we have where we have not got the ability to cope with the overwhelming emotion or sensations that traumatic experience may be, and our brains will respond. When we are babies, if we are left to cry, so you know how there's a lot of different methods for raising babies. Like if you were a baby that was neglected and never picked up or held, you can die from not being touched. They've done research, and I think it was Lithuania or Romania or something like that, where the orphans, it's quite a famous study where orphans, they went through a period of history where they were like, we're just going to leave them and not touch them. And they all died. The only ones that started to thrive were the ones that were picked up, or they found out that some nurses were coming up and cuddling them. So we are biologically wired to respond. But yes, when we grow up, some people survive things like that or periods of that when they're a child. And if things happen to you when you're a baby, you can't remember that. I mean, my 5-year-old daughter can't remember things from 2 years ago. So in those early phases, sometimes we might be having difficulties in relationships, difficulties with our mental health. That's usually before we can remember. And it takes like a good therapist, a good trauma-informed therapist, to be able to help navigate those sort of situations. But sometimes we have memories from childhood that we've completely forgotten. They could come up, like severe traumatic memory could come up and surface when you're 60 years old and completely turn your life upside down. And it happens to a lot of people.
Wow. And so what are some ways that may manifest? You touched on a couple. You mentioned that electric shock kind of feeling. It may be different for different people, but what are some of I reckon what I'm more interested in, what are some of the physiological impacts that people might potentially start to identify, which maybe just through lack of understanding are putting in the basket of just generalized anxiety or something like that, when in fact it could be a trauma response? So what are some of the physiological impacts to be aware of?
Gosh, like that is such a huge thing, because it's dependent on the trauma, it's dependent on the person. Trauma is stored in the body as memory. So sometimes we can have feelings in our body. We can have things called emotional flashbacks, and you can have I can never say the word somatoform or somaticized symptoms. I can't say it. Somatic symptoms. So an emotional flashback, this is what happened to me. I had both. I began to have extremely strong emotional reactions to men in particular. in positions of power or authority. I was transferring a lot of my childhood fears and experiences onto present situations that were not actually, they didn't match the current situation. So my body was protecting me, thinking we're back there, when I consciously did not have any particular need to be afraid, but my body was in terror. My stress responses were on, and I basically wanted to punch men in the face, like probably half decent people. But it was what we call an emotional flashback, where we are experiencing emotions that were unable to be processed at that age. It's like our brain begins to release them, to begin to process them, and it's terrifying and can really destabilize your life. So it might, like with trauma coming up, it might look like very strong emotional, it's called affect dysregulation, which is a cornerstone symptom of complex PTSD, which is the ability to regulate your emotions. So emotions just out of control. And with the somatic-based symptoms, yes, that can be pain flashbacks, where we feel pain in the body. And a lot of the time, and this happened to me, I was having a lot of gut symptoms and physiological symptoms, thinking that I was sick and dying when there was nothing wrong with me. And they were doing all these tests, and that's very common. There's a very high correlation, particularly for women who've experienced sexual assault, between fibromyalgia, which is a pain condition, and sexual abuse.
Wow.
And a lot of people, like women in particular, I think 1 in 4 will experience some kind of sexual assault under the age of 15, I think, which is huge. And yet we're not looking at the impacts physiologically, emotionally, attachment wise, on how this affects our behavior and our experience of the world when we grow up.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. If you sort of zoom out and look at it logically, it makes sense that these sort of experiences are going to have some sort of lasting impact. I think people generally understand that, like, I guess the psychological impact, like how that might manifest, but then it's nice to now, it's interesting to unpack how it also shows up in the body. I love that you mentioned, trauma being looked at as a memory stored in the body. I think it's a really good way to kind of conceptualize what happens there. And then, of course, if you're not properly informed and you don't have this awareness, it's, you can see how people can really fall into repetitive cycles of trying, or talking off air about, seeing different therapists and trying different modalities, and people particularly involved or interested in the personal growth space because they're so curious and open to solving their own problems. And then, of course, for others, it's often, ambiguous. And so drawing some light, I suppose, on understanding where it comes from is really important. But then also, I imagine a large part of the work that you're doing now is educating people on, okay, what can we do to start to regulate the body, the nervous system, the mind? And so just sort of transitioning into that, are there best practices for people, and certainly for yourself in your own journey, I'd love to know, that you found really helpful to, I guess, start to recalibrate that nervous system and, ultimately feel better?
Yeah. Okay. So when it came to all of my stuff coming up, the sad thing is that if people don't get trauma-informed care, the cycle, the train of recovery, like that they're going to be set on, is they're going to go to all different people for help. They're going to go to coaches, they're going to go to psychologists, they're going to go to doctors, and generally they're going to be approached, like you said, like they're going to have this mechanistic approach where they're going to separate body from mind. They're going to say, okay, we're going to send you to a psychologist for your mind, and they're going to look at your mind and how you can, better think better. But the issue with trauma is that complex trauma hijacks the rational brain. So I mentioned before that one of the cornerstone symptoms is affect dysregulation. So that happens because the amygdala, or the fear center of our brain, is on high alert all the time. We go into fight, flight, freeze. And no matter how much personal work you're going to try and do on reflecting on your thinking and trying to have a better attitude, it's not going to work it will not work, because trauma is firing in the emotional parts of the brain, in the right part of the brain, not your left part of your brain. The logical, all of that shuts off. So what ends up happening, we go to get help from coaches and these suggestions, and then we fail at them. And then when we fail at them, the coaches or the doctors or whatever, they are like, this person's just got a shit attitude, and then shames them inadvertently, but they don't have any more solutions to them. So that's the point at which trauma-informed takes a whole 360-degree different approach, and it looks at, okay, this person has got trauma surfacing for a reason. Something is freaking coming up here, and generally what it is no safety. So the difference between someone with a single event trauma and someone with complex trauma is, if you have a trauma later in life, like say you went to war, you had a nice foundation of your identity, of your sense of safety in the world. That is a privilege that you can return to after you've processed that trauma. If you've got complex trauma and then you experience a traumatic event, you have no foundation for your sense of safety in the world to return to. And so really all of the recovery journey is about going back to that foundation and creating safety. So if you look at, there's a wonderful, we've been talking a lot about the body holding trauma. Pretty much the father of complex PTSD is a man named Bessel van der Kolk. He's a psychiatrist from the Netherlands, and I was lucky enough to do his 2-day workshop in 2020 before COVID hit. And he discovered complex PTSD with another psychiatrist named Judith Herman. And if you look at both of their approaches to recovery, it's about establishing safety. So when I became unwell, my friend who was the psychiatrist ended up taking me in. She said, we're getting you out of all these other things. You're coming to see me, which, normally a psychiatrist wouldn't do for a friend, but I was up shit creek and there was no one helping me, and she took me on. And the first thing she said to me, and I'll never forget it, because my husband at the time was with me and he worked for a church, right? And I used to be very involved in the church, and I'm not anymore, but that environment was what triggered my trauma because of all the male dominated patriarchal controlling environment we were in. My husband, beautiful man, but we were in a system that triggered my trauma. And I remember we sat down and he didn't understand why I was having all these emotional reactions for so long in that environment. And then I remember the psychiatrist, Dr. Karen Williams, she's amazing. She just looked at him and she said, well, Grant, that's because you're a big, tall man with a big dick. And so you're never going to understand what it's like to be a woman in an environment like that. You're never going to understand. And then if you're a woman who's experienced abuse and trauma over many years from men in power, you're never going to understand it. So the first thing was validation. And I think a lot of the time, the first thing in trauma-informed is, if people are not changing their behavior and things are still coming up and they're still getting triggered, it's because no one ever said to you, your feelings are valid, your anger is valid. And we really don't like doing that in our left brain centered, like positive psychology era that we live in.
It's like, let's fix the problem almost.
Let's fix the problem. But the problem is that the person didn't get anyone. They say, I think I read somewhere, and this is perfectly explains it. Trauma is that which stays in the body in the absence of an empathetic witness. So until someone has had an empathetic witness to their pain, like today, my daughter, her brother ran his bike into her. So slack, just brother and sister stuff, just being annoying to each other, and he hurt her a little bit. She comes to me bawling her eyes out. I could have just left her and said, oh, calm down. And this is only a small thing, but imagine an abuse situation where as a child, you are continually having your boundaries crossed, your feelings neglected, you don't matter, your needs don't matter. And then no one ever acknowledged it. And your emotional reactions, you'd be in trouble for it if you were to stick up for yourself. You'd be potentially in danger if you were to fight back. If that has happened over a long period of time, it's going to all come up in adulthood. You're not okay. Your boundaries were crossed. And so you need the cuddles, you need the empathy, you need that attachment to go, I see you, I see your pain. And then as a child, we learn to regulate ourselves. It's almost like in adulthood, through the therapeutic relationship that we have with our therapist or whoever our trauma-informed connection is, we need to basically have a safe attachment in adulthood to do the work that childhood missed out on.
It's a powerful idea. And I suppose what we're talking about here just goes back to that idea of creating safety, right? It feels like the perfect word.
Very simple human stuff. It's actually really difficult to evidence base, and it's very difficult to turn into a gold standard clinical treatment, because it actually comes back to human decency and human connection and human attachment. And we really don't like that in our Aussie convict history. Like, we're not affectionate. We don't actually naturally do these things for each other. And then we wonder why we have marriages just blowing up, people having affairs, people, we're not an emotionally engaged or validating to emotion culture.
And I reckon that what's super interesting about that idea of like empathy, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, empathy, relationships, feeling safety, and the validation piece. What's super interesting is, juxtaposed against other areas of our life, whether it's, in our body and mind that we're trying to improve or change or fix, dare I say it, whatever it might be. It can be challenging if you go down that road and you're exploring the wrong modalities and the wrong approaches, yet people around you, by contrast, are, promoting different ideas, and you can do this. And in large part, I subscribe to the idea that we can always get better, improve, and da. But then if you're doing the wrong fucking things, is what I'm hearing from you, then all of a sudden, like, I imagine we'll start to judge ourselves.
100%.
Why the fuck am I not getting better? Yeah.
That was me, and that is me. I feel like I became a high school teacher because I innately knew I was always, I was an intelligent girl, but I had a really rough start to life. And I felt like, I said to my therapist, I said, I feel like I've got an invisible disability that no one sees. And she said, that's exactly right. And I said, and the world is built for the people who don't have it. The world's built for people like who can just suck it up and have the good attitude. And I'm falling on my face and exhausted. And I just felt like through my life, I was just falling over. And my body just couldn't handle the expectations of life. And no one on the outside would. And I was very good at compartmentalizing my life as a survival mechanism. So my way of coping with trauma was to switch off the trauma I experienced in my personal life and get to school looking all pretty. And I was so good at because I knew if I'm going to survive in this world, I have to be someone who hasn't got this story. So I would switch it off, but it all came back up. And I guess I got to the point where it was coming up so much that my body eventually broke, and my nervous system. And it was 10 months of basically, my therapist said it's like a semi-trailer is now flying down a mountain, and no pushing of one brake is going to stop it. It's going to be a long, slow, multiple approach. There's not one size fits all treatment because it's unique to you. We need to get your body calm. We need to find your safety. We need you to put your boundaries in. And that's a whole life shift. And no one, unfortunately, there aren't many people who understand how to support us. Our friends won't get it. Our closest people won't get it. But yes, we feel like failures when we have complex trauma, because no one understands that how much it affects our body and day-to-day ability to meet expectations of life.
Definitely. So you've built this amazing community online now. I'll link to the show in the show notes where people can connect with you. And we know we've spoken about validation, empathy, feeling safety, unpack complex trauma, what it is. And I think it'd be interesting. I reckon some people tuning in may resonate, and some may just be super familiar with identifying these sort of symptoms in people that they know and love. So it'd be really interesting to see, what people can do with this information. But for the people that connect with you now through your community, are there common questions or common concerns that you find that people are coming to you with, or are there common themes that you feel like you now want to use this platform and your understanding and your own journey to start to, I guess, help with?
Yes. So the reason I started my page was because once I got that trauma-informed care, it's like a whole light bulb switched in my head. And I, first of all, realized I am normal. I was suicidal. I thought no one could help me. When I went through that re-traumatization in therapy, I became worse and worse. And when I say trauma resurfacing is the most painful, horrible, lonely experience. Like, it's such a hard thing to explain. But when I tell my story on Instagram and people have connected, everyone says the same thing. Yes, I felt like my brain had shattered into a million pieces. I felt like that too. And it's such an intense thing that people go through. And once you realize you're not alone, that's the beginning of hope, right? And the biggest thing is when you have complex trauma, it's a very hopeless situation. So initially why I started my page was because when I was very unwell, no one understood me. I went on like Instagram, and all of the abuse and trauma stuff is very dark, like really hopeless. Like, it was very angry, and that's a valid experience.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know I'm going to get better, because I didn't think I was going to. I thought there is no way my brain is ever going to get back together again, and I'll never enjoy life again. I'll never feel good again, and I'll never be able to mother again. And once I got the trauma-informed care, I just sucked onto every little bit of education that made me feel like there was hope. And I started to write about my experience and what I was learning. And then I started to see people going, oh my God, that's me too, me too, me too. So like I've said, sometimes people are doing all of these self-work, but it's not working because they need to get validation. So I am trying to offer, first and foremost, the validation that may prevent someone ending their life, because they're realizing, okay, I think I know, I've had this life experience as well, and this girl has as well. And so that means that there's hope. What else did you ask in questions? Sorry, I always get a bit sidetracked, and when I'm passionate about
I was curious
something.
I'm very much the same. Don't ever ask me a question about rap music, because then I'll go on a tangent for about 5 hours.
Oh yay! I'm such a ghetto bitch.
I'll have to get you on
just
for part,
who I am.
We'll get you on for part 2. We'll just digress over a couple of vinos and talk about the best music. I guess, and look, I think we've provided a really good insight into what complex trauma looks like, and what some of the really important best practices are to start. And that validation piece is huge. I think what's really interesting is we look at the lay of the land right now in the world, obviously with COVID running rife throughout the world, and just this sheer volume of isolation and the impact that that's having is crazy. So what's interesting is if you take COVID out of it and put life back to quote unquote normal, and you've got someone like yourself, like you've alluded to, and so many other people that still have that same feeling despite what's reflected on the outside and what's normal on paper. It's that feeling of isolation, of not being understood, of not being connected. It's just as detrimental. And so I suppose, the idea of being able to connect with people who know what they're talking about, people that have gone through similar experiences, or at least experiences the same kind of visceral response in their body, is I imagine to some extent kind of encouraging to then start not feeling as isolated, right?
Yeah. So that was the initial start, is to just provide, like, my page is called c-PTSD Hope. It's that, okay, you might have been diagnosed with it, or you identify that you have complex trauma. A lot of people who come to my page have had a crisis, like a trauma resurfacing or a severe breakdown, where they've realized, okay, this is something pretty fucking serious, and I'm desperate to know that I'm going to be okay. So a lot of the people who come to my page are people who were in a similar situation to me. They're a bit further behind in the journey of starting to realize, oh my God, I think that maybe all of these symptoms and mental health symptoms and things that are happening to me, or relational difficulties, are as a result of my childhood. So I am trying to provide first the validation that what they have been through is valid, the education for them to understand some of the science. Like psychoeducation is such an important part in trauma recovery, because no one is a better expert on your story than you. However, in saying that, we need other people to heal from trauma, because if you haven't been shown, we are shown how to love ourselves when we are attached to healthily in childhood. And if you've never received that, we need people around us. So I'm trying to create a community online, and I'm so proud of it, because it really is the safest, most beautiful bunch of people that all support one another. And I have a lot of interaction in my comments. So I do coaching one-on-one for people who are in that sort of crisis and need help, because complex trauma is it's a whole life affecting thing. I'm not a therapist. I don't go into deep trauma. I probably will end up going in that direction in the future. But what I do is help people who've probably done their therapy, but now they need to case manage their life, because it affects our health, it affects our physiology. So we need to, like, you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, it's like the triangle where we have base needs, and we can only get to the top of like self-actualization and it's such a privilege to be up the top there. But if we don't have our base needs met, like our breath, our food, our shelter, our body warmth, things like that, everything's a foundation on top of that. So I really try to help people to build their lives. If their lives are falling apart up here, or they're not up here, and you've got complex trauma, it's because these base levels require a lot more support. And the most devastating thing to me is that people with complex trauma are some of the most empathetic and gorgeous souls you'll ever meet, because they know what it's like to feel isolated, alone, and rejected. So what they have to offer the world is huge. So we need people with that empathy up the top. And that potential is huge. So I love to support high achieving people that have complex trauma to remain in that place of being able to do what they do best in the world.
Very well said. I love that framing of having these fundamentals met first. So many people are trying to self-actualize, which should be the North Star, just to feel as good as possible. But it could be an important place to start the lowest hanging fruit, which might be these fundamentals. And hopefully today's chat has maybe just drawn some awareness for some people around, hey, maybe there's something that I'm missing in that space. So guys, 100%. I encourage you to connect with Jess. I'll link all your details in the show notes. And once again, really appreciate you making the time. This was super fascinating and really important conversation to have.
I really appreciate it anytime. And if anyone has any questions, please ask away. I love connecting. So